Sometimes the line between a wild conspiracy theory and a declassified government document is, well, it's way thinner than you'd think. So today, we're going to dive into some of those unbelievable stories that sounded like pure fiction, right up until they were proven to be shockingly true.
It sounds like a question straight out of a spy movie, right? The perfect, untraceable murder. For years, people whispered that the CIA had a weapon that could do exactly that. It always seemed like something made up for Hollywood, until the CIA director himself was forced to testify in front of the US Senate.
Yeah, that quote, that's not from some spy novel. That's from the 1975 testimony of the actual CIA director, William Colby. He confirmed that they had a poison dart gun that fired a frozen toxin. It would literally melt inside the body, cause a massive heart attack, and leave behind nothing but a tiny red mark. A perfectly deniable assassination.
And this heart attack gun wasn't just some one-off gadget cooked up in a lab. Nope. It was part of a much larger and frankly way more sinister program, Project MK Naomi. Its entire purpose was to create a whole stockpile of deadly biological and chemical agents specifically for covert operations.
Okay, but not all of these covert ops were as grim as poison darts. Some of them were they were just bizarre. It turns out the CIA had a whole menagerie of four-legged and even winged field agents.
So get this. In the 1960s, the CIA launched something called Operation Acoustic Kitty. The plan, and they were 100% serious about this, was to surgically implant listening devices into a cat and then just let it wander near Soviet officials to eavesdrop on their conversations. And we're not talking about a small budget here. They poured a staggering $20 million into Operation Acoustic Kitty. I mean, think about that. That's so much money just to turn a house cat into a high-tech surveillance device with a microphone in its ear and a transmitter at the base of its skull. So after all that time, all that money, all that surgery, what happened on its very first mission? Well, the cat was released near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and was almost immediately hit and killed by a taxi. The entire $20 million project was a tragic and, let's be honest, a kind of comical failure. And this wasn't just some weird, one-off idea. Oh no. The CIA also developed dragonfly-sized drones, they strapped cameras to pigeons for aerial photography, and they even made robotic catfish to test water for nuclear runoff. It really seems like during the Cold War, no idea was too strange for the world of espionage. From the bizarre, we now have to turn to the deeply, deeply disturbing. What happens when the target of deception isn't a foreign enemy, but your own people? Let's look at some very real plans to actually manufacture a reason for war. Okay, so it's 1962. Tensions with Cuba are at an absolute boiling point. The U.S. Department of Defense drafts a top-secret plan with a very clear and very shocking objective: to create a pretext for a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and the details are just horrifying. They proposed committing actual acts of terror against American citizens, bombings in Miami and Washington, D.C., and then planting fake evidence to blame it all on Fidel Castro. They even talked about blowing up one of their own ships to create a moment like the USS Maine to get the public fired up for war. And what's truly terrifying is how close this came to actually happening. This wasn't some fringe idea from a rogue agent. This was formally approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the entire country. The only person who stopped it was President John F. Kennedy. He personally rejected the plan. But just 2 years later, a very similar playbook was used to escalate the Vietnam War. After a real skirmish on August 2, 1964, the U.S. government claimed a second, totally unprovoked attack happened on August 4th. But it was a lie. Years later, declassified documents and even the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, admitted it never happened. But by then, the damage was done. That fake report was used to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which massively escalated American involvement in Vietnam.
So, we've seen deception used for spying and to start wars, but the conspiracies get even more shocking when governments decide to turn their own citizens into unwitting test subjects.
This was called Operation Sea Spray. To test how vulnerable the city was to a bioweapon, the Navy sailed a ship just off the coast of San Francisco and sprayed huge clouds of 2 different kinds of bacteria over the city for 7 straight days. They thought the bacteria were harmless. They were dead wrong. In the weeks after the test, 11 people were admitted to a local hospital with extremely rare infections caused by one of the bacteria that was released. One of them, a man who was just recovering from surgery, died. The direct, fatal consequence of a secret experiment on an unsuspecting American city was now completely undeniable. And this was not an isolated incident. During Prohibition in the 1920s, government officials got so frustrated with the booming black market for alcohol that they ordered industrial manufacturers to poison their products with deadly methyl alcohol, knowing full well it was being stolen and sold directly to the public. The government's twisted logic was that this would scare people into sobriety. Instead, bootleggers just sold the poison anyway, and the death toll was catastrophic. It's estimated that over 5,000 people died as a direct result of this government policy. But somehow, it gets even darker. In the 1950s, a secret study called Project Sunshine was launched. Scientists needed to understand how radioactive fallout affected human bones, especially in kids. So they began secretly harvesting tissue from the recently deceased, focusing on babies and young children, often without the knowledge or consent of their grieving parents. This project was global, and the human cost is just devastating to think about. In one case from the UK, a mother reported that doctors took her stillborn baby's legs for the study, and to hide what they had done, they refused to let her dress her own child for the funeral. An unimaginable violation on top of an already immense tragedy.
And this kind of deception isn't something that's just confined to the distant past. During the hunt for Osama bin Laden, the CIA organized a fake hepatitis B vaccination campaign in a Pakistani city. Their goal wasn't to prevent disease, it was to secretly collect DNA from local kids to try and confirm bin Laden's location.
Well, the operation failed to find bin Laden's family, but the fallout for public health was devastating. When the story broke, public trust in vaccination programs was shattered. Healthcare workers were attacked, accused of being foreign spies, and the result? A massive resurgence of polio. By 2014, Pakistan accounted for 85% of all polio cases in the entire world. And that brings us to the final unsettling thought. Poisons, animal spies, manufactured wars, deadly experiments on citizens. These all sounded like wild theories until they were proven true. It really forces us to ask, if this is what we know about from the past, what truths are still waiting to be declassified today?